unit, this next 8 weeks, is kind of where we bring it home a little bit. This is where we're going to hopefully kind of take the outline and the skeleton and all we've been working on thus far and places we've started to fill it in. And now we're going to actually kind of play with it and have like this metaphorical like sandbox where we can kind of toss our ideas into it and see if they work or not, and see if they actually hold water, and see what happens when they rub up against other ideas and when they rub up against things that disagree with them, and can we actually explain why we believe what we believe and why we hold certain positions and all of that type of stuff. So to that end, we are going to process and talk about apologetics. Now, before we do that, before we kind of jump into a little bit of an introduction to apologetics and kind of a deeper expository work on the textbook, let me pray for us, and then we'll kind of see what we read this week. We're going to talk a little bit more in depth about a few aspects. We're going to watch a video that kind of goes into even more depth of an introduction to apologetics. But before we do any of that, let me pray for us, and we'll all take a deep breath, and then we'll get going tonight. Lord, thank you for bringing us through the past several weeks of Institute. We're excited to finally be in this last 8-week unit of apologetics. God, would you reveal stuff to us that we didn't previously know, and help make things clear and kind of click in our brains so that we can not only understand it better ourselves, but also explain it better to other people, both Christians and non-Christians, because we need to be able to talk about our faith. We need to be able to fulfill the Great Commission. We actually have to open our mouths. So God, we want to be faithful to that. We want to be clear in our speech and loving in our speech about the things of you. So would you help us to that end as we endeavor to do that, both as individuals but also as a community? Jesus, would you be with us and guide us? Holy Spirit, would you kind of open our eyes and our hearts and our minds? It's in the name of Jesus we pray all of these things. Amen. Okay, just real quick housekeeping again. I'm going to keep saying this just so it's in our brains. November 15th is our last Thursday. That's the night we're going to do big catered kind of dinner party. So make sure you mark that on your calendar. We're going to be sending out invitations to that because you're welcome to bring your spouse or a significant other or whoever with you to that. So just be on the lookout for that. In the next couple weeks, we'll send out an invitation. But November 15th is our last night. I know, right? It's basically tomorrow. But you definitely do not want to miss that night. We're going to have a few special guests, and it's going to be great. So just kind of housekeeping. If you don't, I think all of you have your textbooks, I think. Okay, great. I have a few left over if we get some people in here who haven't picked them up yet. I have more. Okay, apologetics. If we haven't used our brains enough already, we really are going to have to use our brains when we come to this topic. Now, this week was probably the easiest of any of them, and some of you are like, oof, oof. This week was easy because we were talking about what you believe. We were talking about what we think, and so hopefully you're like, yeah, that makes sense. That's kind of, I'm somewhere close to that, or that's kind of where I fall. Christian theism or Christian deism, where we actually are proclaiming that that the God of the Bible, the Christian God, is the one true God, and that has radical implications for us and how we interact with the world. Hopefully that felt like home to you. If it didn't, then that's okay, but you're not a Christian if that didn't feel like home to you. I hate to break it to you. But I say that this was probably the easiest because, again, it should have felt like home. It should have felt like, yeah, this feels familiar. Not a whole lot of new terminology. Conceptually, maybe it was a little different of an approach, but the ideas should have felt pretty familiar. And so as we kind of move forward into other approaches to the world, other worldviews, it's going to become maybe less and less familiar. You'll hear words that you kind of hear thrown around, things like postmodernism, deism, things like that, pantheism, naturalism, things like that. You'll hear, and you're like, oh, I kind of know what that word means, or I've heard it. But now we're actually going to talk about what they mean. Now, there's multiple approaches to apologetics. So let's kind of set the tone a little bit. Let's kind of get our bearings. Because this book is not going to walk us through things like, so there's apologetics that are more philosophical in nature. So you have apologetics where you're doing things like, for example, the ontological argument for the existence of God, the cosmological argument for the existence of God, the teleological argument for the existence of God. Things like that, where you have premises, if this, therefore this is my conclusion, right? So you have logical types of approaches like that. And you have approaches to apologetics that are more philosophical or scientific or metaphysical in nature. Things like the ontological, teleological arguments and cosmological arguments, where you're actually arguing from something's existence. So the cosmological argument, cosmos, cosmological, those are kind of that same root there, is going to argue for the existence of God based on the nature of the cosmos, based on its order, based on its creation, based on its existence. All those types of things, right? Teleological is arguing towards the telos, the end of something. So you have approaches to apologetics that are more like that are more philosophical, metaphysical kind of things that are like in our brains. They're more conceptual. Then you have apologetics that is more kind of, I'm going to talk with a Buddhist. I'm going to talk with a Muslim. I'm going to talk with an atheist or a naturalistic pantheist or something like that, right? So you have apologetics in those types of veins. And then you have another approach to apologetics that has come to be called cultural apologetics. Cultural apologetics is more of an approach where we have arguments from things like beauty. We have arguments from things like, how can we take the culture that we are encountering? For example, how can we use film? How can we use movies to argue for a Christian worldview? It's more kind of conversational in some ways. It's a little bit easier for some people. Although to do cultural apologetics, you have to have a grasp on the culture. You can't be kind of like really separated from it. You got to kind of be up with what's going on in the world. You got to be aware of the culture you're dealing with and the age that you're dealing with of the person and their kind of perspective and things like that. So there's all kinds of approaches and veins and streams of apologetics. This book is taking kind of one approach, and it's going to address some different worldviews. So you're going to get things like deism, naturalism, nihilism, existentialism, Eastern pantheistic monism, things like that. You're not going to get so much the how do I argue for the existence of God type of approach. That's other textbooks, that's other things. Important. You should look into that, and I'm going to post some videos for those of you who have inquiring minds on how to do that, on how to start approaching those arguments. But this textbook is approaching it kind of from a different way. Throughout the next 7 weeks, we're going to talk about all of those approaches. We're going to focus on the textbook because that's what's in front of us. But I'm going to try to rope in some of these other arguments, other approaches, other things. The reason I'm doing that is mostly because I'm realizing, especially as I read through some of y'all's comments and reading responses, that most of us haven't given a lot of thought to some of this. Most of us haven't really done some heavier lifting in areas of philosophy, in ontology, and being, and things of that nature. And some of you are going like, yeah, that doesn't interest me at all. I don't really see the point. There's a huge point. There's a huge point. So doing some really good heavy lifting mentally is going to be key. We're going to kind of scratch our brains and go, I don't have a grasp on that yet. That's okay. So kind of be prepared to be like, I need to listen to that another time, or I need to watch that video that she posted 3 times to kind of grasp. That's kind of we're about to kind of jump into the deep end a little bit, and so that's kind of where we're going. But let's just start with a real basic, what is apologetics? Let's just go back to basics. Why are we doing what we're doing? What's the point of all of this? Why should Christians care? If we already are believing, or we think we believe the truth, isn't that enough? Isn't that enough of a position to have? And the answer that I would offer you is no, because even the scriptures tell us, hey, you should be ready, you should be prepared to give a defense for the hope that is within you. This is what the New Testament tells us. You should be ready, prepared, able, considering these things often, to give a reason, to give a defense, to give an apologia, an apologetic, for the hope that is within you. Now, our hope is in the gospel and is in the Christian worldview and is in those types of things, right? So we should be able and ready and willing and capable to give an apologia, to give a defense. That's what the root of apologetics comes from, for why we are hopeful people, for why we buy into the hope of the gospel, for why we buy in to a predominantly, or to rather just a pure Christian worldview. We should be ready to do that. And I think that most Christians, even most of us in this room, would kind of be like, I kind of could maybe say a few sentences strung together in some form of cohesive thought. And that's about it. And that really is only if you ask me and you're also a Christian, because I have to explain it in Christian terms. And I can't explain it to you if you are not a Christian, or I can't explain it to you if we don't have like common terms, or you don't already have my understanding of things. And that's where most of us get stuck, and there's a little bit of shame involved with that too for some of us, and we kind of just get discouraged and we go, I'm going to leave that to the professionals. That's enough for me, right? My argument is that the Bible does not let us off the hook. The Spirit of God inside of us does not let us off the hook when it comes to thinking deeply and intelligently and on purpose about these things. So apologetics, apologia, to give a defense, to speak in defense about what we believe, why we believe it, why we have hope. And again, some of us, we come to this and we're just like, I'm just kind of ashamed that I can't do this. That's okay. We're going to process it together. This is a lifelong learning thing. You don't all of a sudden go, well, I have mastered the cosmological argument for the existence of God, and I'm good to go. I could like destroy anyone who comes against me. No. Like, this is an ongoing learning thing that we have to brush up on. We have to keep up with culture. We have to keep up with what are the arguments of today? What are people believing today? What am I giving an apologetic against? That's a really good thing that we need to be aware of. And everyone's going to kind of come at you differently. So let me give you just a few really quick, easy tips for engaging in conversation. This should be really easy for us because we're humans and we have conversations, but people just cannot do this for some reason. One, and this is something we've learned throughout the whole Institute thing, is you have to define terms. You have to define terms. Remember how when we started talking about Christian theology several weeks ago, and I said, what do you mean when you say the word God? You have to define your terms. Because if you're going to come into conversation, especially if you're going to come into conversation with someone who's not a Christian, and even if someone is a Christian, you still should do some work to define terms. But especially if you're going to engage in conversation, you need to define your terms. What do you mean when you use that word? And then you need to use that word in the same way consistently throughout your argument, throughout the conversation. If you're using the word cat one way here, if you're going to define the word cat for this argument as this black house cat that lives in my neighbor's house, that's the cat I'm talking about. And then 3 steps into your argument, or a half an hour into the conversation, you start using the word cat and you mean a tiger. No. bad, you got to define your terms and be consistent. And we're going to learn more about that as we go. I'm just kind of giving you guys a preview. You got to define your terms. Secondly, maybe firstly, this isn't like in any order. This is just kind of getting some things out there. We have to be good listeners. Again, this should just be basic conversation as a human 101, but we're just not good at it. You have to be a good listener. I have to be a good listener. Not listening to respond, not listening, and as I'm listening to you, I'm formulating my argument about how to destroy you. No. You have to sit and actually listen, take it in, and then move forward. Again, this should just be basic to us, but we forget it, and we're bad at it. So define our terms. Define our terms. Be a good listener. Here's another thing. Understand the other person's position. Again, this should just be really basic, but we have a really hard time with it. Understand the other person's position. Good ways to do that are to restate it and say, I'm hearing you say this. Is this correct? Is this what you mean? Ask good questions. We need to become good question askers when we are engaged in conversation with other people. Understand their position, and insofar as you are able, try to embody their position. Try to kind of like get inside of it and kind of look around at the world from within their position by asking them questions and say, well, what do you think about this? Like, if this happens, how do you respond from your worldview or from your perspective or with your question that you're bringing to the table? As much as is possible, and it's never entirely possible to walk in someone else's shoes, but try to get inside of that and embody it for a hot minute and say, okay, this is how they see the world based on what they're telling me. Ask clarifying questions. These are all good practices for when we come to engage with people who do not believe the same thing we do. And it also is good practice, honestly, when you're talking with Christians. Again, going back all the way back to our first 8 weeks together, talking about biblical interpretation, if you and I have differing positions on how to exegete a passage of Scripture, everything I just told you is good practice. It's good ways to have conversations. Again, humans should just kind of have this, but we don't. So I always feel like I have to say it. Now, some of you, based on your reading responses, some of you were shocked to realize you have a worldview. Some of you are shocked at this, right? You're like, I did not know I had a worldview. You have a worldview. Whether you want to or not, every single person that you come in contact with has a worldview. We have a way of both seeing or viewing the world. We have a way of embodying and inhabiting the world. We have a way of making decisions. We have a way of weighing what we consider good and bad. We have a way of deciding what we think is right. All of that is wrapped up in your worldview. Your worldview, whether you realize it or not, is kind of the wellspring of why you are the way you are and how you engage with the world. Now, we all have caveats with our worldviews. Again, hopefully, the chapter you read this week, chapter 2, after the introduction, I guess the first full chapter after the introduction, should have felt pretty similar to your worldview in some ways. Again, maybe with some caveats, maybe with things you would emphasize more or kind of switch or something like that. But generally speaking, a Christian worldview is where we're gonna inhabit in this space. So things like, what do you think, and this is one of the questions the textbook is going to ask about each of these worldviews, what do you think about humanity? Christian response to that, generally speaking, has something to do with we are created in the image of God, right? Humans share have an elevated position amongst all of God's creation. We're unique. We're not like tigers and lions and bears, right? We're created beings, but we're not animals in that way. There's something unique about us. We usually call it the image of God, the Imago Dei. We're created with a purpose. We're created with the capacity to know God, which is a gift. And God has designed us to want to be in relationship, both with Him and with each other. Things of that nature kind of fall in that, right? Now, again, some of you are like, I didn't realize that was a worldview. That definitely is a worldview. That's part of your worldview. Now, what a lot of us do, or what a lot of us don't do, is we never stop to consider our worldview. We never stop to actually kind of like pick it apart and say, does this ring true? Is this consistent with this? Am I consistent within my belief system? And that takes work and that takes time. Here's another just tidbit of good practice as we get ready to launch ourselves into apologetics. A good kind of ontological, a good thinking practice, a good thing to try is if you're considering something, an option, a position, an idea, a concept, it's good practice to, as much as you are able, take that concept, take that thought, think about it for a while, mull it over, and then run it through to its like furthest out conclusion that you could possibly get to. What I mean by that is like, if I say Jesus is Lord, that has some radical implications, right? So it's a good practice to see if I actually believe that, to then like run that out to its furthest conclusion that I can think of, and that furthest conclusion usually has radical implications for my life. Jesus is Lord means that I'm not, and then it means all these other things. So let that play out in your brain when you're reading about other positions. My encouragement to you is not to just go, well, it's not Christian, so I'm just going to kind of skim over it and not really give it a whole lot of thought. No, you should give it a lot of thought. One, because we need to kind of know what other people think. And two, because we have to understand why we don't think that. Those are two different things, right? And so give it time, read about the worldviews, read about them, and again, try to think critically, try to inhabit them in your brain, and then think about why you aren't that way. Or why you are that way, maybe. I don't know. But that's just good practice. Let's talk about worldview. Page 6 in your textbook. He quotes another author and says this in the middle there. What's a worldview? A worldview is a commitment, a fundamental orientation of the heart. We're going to come back to that idea in a second. That can be expressed as a story or in a set of presuppositions, assumptions which may be true, partially true, or entirely false. That we hold consciously, subconsciously, consistently, or inconsistently about the basic constitution of reality, and that provides the foundation on which we live and move and have our being. Let's go back to this idea of a worldview as being an orientation of the heart. Some of us, I think you mentioned this in your writing about C.S. Lewis. Lewis in Abolition of Man talks about men without chests. Have any of you read Abolition of Man? Tom? Just one. That's fine. That's fine. I'll roll with it. I'm going to stick with my guns on this one. Usually I try to pick illustrations that are more universally accepted and understood, but we're going to roll with it. In Abolition of Man, Lewis talks about men without chests. And he doesn't mean that there's like some mutant like race running around out there that doesn't have chests, like that just has like no torso at all, basically. What he's talking about is how humans can be kind of compartmentalized into three different things. This is actually kind of Platonic in some ways, but it works. One is we have an intellect, we have a mind, right? So we have thoughts, we have concepts and ideas. We also have an appetite, or what he calls the stomach. I'm not speaking literally like, we all have a stomach, but we all have an appetite. We all have something that drives us, right? We have something that we hunger for. We have something almost animalistic in that if it's left unchecked, it can lead to some really bad outcomes, right? If we let our desires and our passions and whatever we want, our appetites run rampant, bad things happen, right? So we have a mind, we have an intellect, we have a gut, we have a stomach or an appetite, and then we have a chest. And the chest is kind of, I'm going to paraphrase a lot, but the chest is like, it's emotion, and it's our will, and it's how we communicate between the head and the stomach. It's how we kind of process where we are in the world, what we believe about the world, how we should act in the world. And what happens to most of us, without us realizing it, is we are either head people or stomach people. We're either all up in our brains all the time, intellect, knowledge. Let me learn as much as possible so I can act right in the world, or so that I can believe right in the world, right? If we're not that, then we're just driven by our appetites mostly. We're kind of like, what feels good? What do I want? What's kind of where's the wind leading me this week, right? And we kind of go that way. Humanity tends to be driven by one or both of those, typically one more than the other, depending on how you're wired as a human being. And what we've done in the church specifically is we haven't done a good job of addressing the chest, even though that's kind of what you think we would do. We're good at kind of giving you information. We're good at like helping you kind of like curtail some of those like appetites and be like, no, that's bad. But we never give you a reason why. We never give you the capacity to reason with your chest, with your heart, and kind of process the world around you in that way. So what we've done is we've produced what Lewis argues is we've produced men or humans without chests. And when it comes to apologetics, when it comes to worldviews, most of us, it's an intellectual thing. It's like, I believe this, or I feel this. And we never kind of consider and let it like seep down into our heart and actually like process it internally in a way that actually affects how we are in the world. So what I want to avoid is, and we've tried to avoid this throughout all of Institute, is just giving us intellectual stimulation. But I also don't want us to have these kind of like visceral, like stomachy, like knee-jerk reactions and go, well, I just don't believe that. Like, the naturalists are wrong. How silly is that? Did you read that chapter? Like, I laughed a lot. Like, that's silly that people would think that. People actually believe that, and you get a good naturalist in here, they'd probably run circles around all of us with being able to explain why they believe what they believe. And so we want to kind of form and be people with all three of those things, our head, our chest, and our stomach kind of working together, so that we have appetites and we have desires that are aligned with our intellect, but that are also kind of connected to why we are in the world, who we are in the world, what we are doing in the world, and things of that nature. Does that make sense? We want to be more integrated people. That's kind of the whole point. We want to be integrated selves. Now, this goes back to this idea of a worldview as a commitment and a fundamental orientation of the heart. It's not a fundamental orientation of what you think, because you can think a lot of things. I can think a lot of things, but they might not come out in my actions. They might not come out in how I actually respond to things. I can think all day long about not eating a whole plate of brownies. I can think about it. I can think about it long and hard and say, I'm not going to eat the brownies. I'm not going to eat the brownies. I'm not going to do it. And then my actions can actually be completely opposite to what I think, right? I can eat the whole plate of brownies. So your worldview is more brownies than it is not eating the brownies. Does that make sense? Your worldview is what spills out in actual life. It's not about what's up here in your brain. We like to think it's, I believe in the Christian God, and I'm a Christian, and I can recite the creed, and I can tell you all these beautiful things. I can explain the gospel to you. That's not your worldview necessarily. Your worldview is where that meets what actually spills out when you get bumped in life. So our worldview is not simply an intellectual thing. It's not just I can kind of write out and explain the whole scriptures and give you the overarching story and explain the covenants, and I can do all the things that we spent the last however many weeks doing. Your worldview is how all that stuff actually where the rubber meets the road. So it's not just an intellectual pursuit. It's actually an orientation of the heart, which is why in this explanation he says that you could have assumptions in your worldview that are true, partially true, or maybe even entirely false. Or you could have a worldview that you have positions that you hold consciously, subconsciously, consistently, or inconsistently. Some of us have very inconsistent worldviews. All of us do in various ways. Again, I believe something, but when it comes to this particular area, I'm going to act in this way. But when it comes to this particular area, kind of dealing with the same concept, I'm going to act in a completely different way. We have inconsistent worldviews sometimes. That's just how all of us are, and we have to kind of work through that. But part of what we're trying to do is to work towards a more consistent worldview. And what I mean by that is how we interact with the world is consistently formed by our Christian worldview. We want to think and act Christianly. We don't want to just think Christianly. We want to act Christianly. We want our worldview to actually spill out and be Christian, not just in our thoughts. And again, that kind of goes back to things that we've been processing for the past however many weeks. The first 4 of our 8-week units has been learning how to think Christianly. Now we're going to process how to act Christianly with what we now know and how it's begun to kind of seep into our hearts and our souls. Because we want to be people with chests. We want to not just be ruled by our intellect, we want to not just be ruled by our appetites, but we want to actually have our heart's alignment spill out into the world in a hopefully Christian way. Now, your textbook talks a little bit more about this in these 8 questions. These 8 questions on page 8 and 9, these are the questions he's going to ask of every single worldview he unpacks. Let's talk about these for a second. What is prime reality? He calls it the really real. What is the actual substance, basis? What's the driving reality of the world, of the cosmos? What is ultimate is another way of maybe thinking about that. And for Christians, we would say God. He answers that and unpacks that in the first chapter and how he kind of does that. So hopefully, maybe if someone were to ask you, hey, what do you think is ultimate? What is kind of the driving force for all of this? What's if you boil it all down, what's the point? What's kind of just undergirding all of this? A Christian worldview response has something to do with God. And not just God, the Christian God. Again, we have to define terms. The Christian God, right? That's important. Especially when you get into apologetics, you can't just throw out the word God. You got to define what God you're talking about. The Christian God. What's the prime reality? The prime reality is that God exists. And then we can start, doing all the extra work of God as creator, God as father, God as triune, all those things, right? But the prime reality from which we are starting as Christians is God. In the beginning, God. That's kind of like ultimate for us. We don't do any further worldview building unless that's a foundation. Or you can, you're just not going to have a very Christian worldview. You can have a worldview built on anything as the answer to question number one, but if it's not God and the Christian God of that, then you're going to have some discontinuity, right? Because some of us, what we want to do is we want to put ourselves as, I'm ultimate. I'm like the whole deal. I'm here, it's all about me, whatever, right? Or some of us want to say it's another type of God, or it's this system, or it's this reality, right? For Christians, we say it's the Christian God is kind of the ultimate reality. Number two, what's the nature of external reality? What's the nature of the world around us? Christians would say, well, it's fallen, it's broken, it's in a state of rebellion against its creator. Again, this is where you get to get creative. We don't all have the same, we have similar worldviews, but we're going to articulate it a little differently, right? Because you're going to tell the story differently than I am, which is kind of the point. We're all different. We're all made differently. We're all going to encounter different people. But Christians would say, hey, the nature of the world, the nature of the cosmos is that it's in subjection to God, but it's in rebellion to God, and we're broken. And we're kind of stuck. And there's not much we can do on our own to fix that. And again, you can drill down as deep with that as you want to, but again, that's kind of the starting point. That's kind of the starting point. When people ask us, hey, what's up with the world? Like, what's going on? And they're going to voice these questions differently. No one is going to come up to you and say, what is the nature of external reality? No one's going to come up to you and say that. But people are going to come up to you and say, why is the world so jacked up? Like, what the heck is going on? Like, have you seen the news? Like, that's how it's going to come out. It's not going to come out with them going, can you explain external reality in your worldview? No. They're going to ask you, the heck, did you see the news? Another school shooting, another hurricane, another earthquake, another coup, another mass shooting, whatever. That's how that question is going to come out. That's how the question of what is the nature of external reality going to play out in conversation. Number three, what is a human being? Some of us are like, I've never even thought about that. Let me tell you, this question is becoming more and more and more prominent and prevalent in the academy and in our science labs. What do we define as a human being? What do we define as consciousness? Things of that nature. I'm not talking about abortion. I'm talking about AI. Talking about robots that are beginning to, just like Terminator warned us, have cognizant thought and have their own thoughts and be able to operate in the world as individuals. And will they be given citizenship and rights and things of that nature? This is becoming more and more of an issue in both the academy and the laboratories of the world. What is a human being? And why are there human beings? And what do we do with human beings? What's the end goal of human beings? How should human beings inhabit the world? These types of questions are some of the questions that are at the forefront of modern day apologetics. And you have apologists right now who are specializing in talking about AI and talking about how do we deal with science and things of that nature. Very, very, very intelligent people, intelligent Christians who are, again, talking about understanding a culture and understanding a world. They understand that world well enough to speak into it from a Christian worldview perspective. So what's a human being? Christians would say, kind of similar to what we've talked about, that we're created in the image of God. God, the Christian God, has made us, and we have a purpose in life. Our purpose is to know and enjoy God and glorify Him forever. If you believe and adhere to the Catechism, the Heidelberg Catechism. You're built with a purpose. You're built to be God's image bearer. You're built to rule the earth and subdue it. And you're blessed to be a blessing, things like that, right? This is kind of how Christians respond to that question. But please know that out of all of these questions, really, probably number 3 is one of the biggest ones going around today. What is a human being, especially, again, in our academies and in our science labs? Number 4, what happens to a person after death? This is a great question that a lot of people get hung up on when it comes to, belief in God. Or when I say God here, I'm meaning the Christian God. Belief in God. Some people desperately want something after death. Some people are completely fine because their worldview allows it for there to be nothing after death. for there to be just nihilism. It's a nihilistic kind of like, have your cake and eat it too while you're here, and then you die, and that's it, right? Some people are very okay with that. At least they say they're okay with that, right? I wonder about the state of them when they're faced with something. But there are people who are very okay with not having any type of concept about what happens after death. Christians would say, we die, right? We're broken, death and sin are kind of, death is our ultimate enemy, but it's been defeated, right? But we still die, and Christians say we die, but that's not the end. Christians affirm a bodily resurrection, right? This is Orthodox Christianity, and of course, you can drill down as far into that as you want, but I'm just kind of giving us the Christian responses in a few different words than he did. Number 5, why is it possible to know anything at all? This is getting a little philosophical for some of us, isn't it? Some of us are like, I don't like this question. It's too weird. It's too big. This is ontology, the study of knowledge. This is ontology. How do we know anything, and can we trust what we know? Can you trust your senses? Can you trust what you perceive? Can you trust what your eyes kind of are taking in all the time? Scientists would actually tell us probably not as much as you think you can. Your brain will lie to you. Your brain will play tricks on you. So how do we know things? This is an important question when it comes to apologetics and when it comes to worldview. Can you actually know things? Descartes went on a whole, he had an existential crisis over this back in the day. Descartes went and broke down and said, how do I know anything? How do I even know that I exist? And that it's not just like my brain kind of just like firing and telling me misinformation. And we kind of sit back and we're like, that's a dumb thing. Of course you exist. Here you are. But you're just trusting your broken, fallen senses to tell you that. So how do we know? And he famously we all say, I think, therefore I am, or something like that. It's actually, his reasoning is more like, I doubt, therefore I am. I question, and so I must be willing to at least have a cognizant thought outside of the system. So if I'm doubting, that means I'm actually able to process thought. And it gets real ontological from there. But is it possible to know anything at all? Can you actually know that God exists? Can you actually know that you were created in God's image? How do we know these things? This is part of the work of apologetics. And especially for Christians, we're answering that from a Christian perspective. Number 6, how do we know right and wrong? How do we know right and wrong? What is ultimate in getting to tell us and helping us determine what is good and bad? Christians would say God's law, love of God, love of neighbor, things of that nature are ultimate in telling us how we should act. God gets to define right and wrong, according to Christians. The Christian God gets to define those things. It's not you do what works for you and I'll do what works for me. It's not that. Some people are that. The Christian perspective is not that. The Christian perspective does not say whatever makes you happy, right? Whatever makes you most comfortable, whatever makes you most safe. That's not the Christian worldview. The Christian worldview says that God gets to determine right and wrong, and that we are to follow in that and not kind of make up our own laws along the way, right? Number 7, what is the meaning of human history? What's the meaning? Why are we here? Basically, how have we ended up in this situation? How do we make sense of what has come before? How do we use that information? Can we trust that information? What's the purpose of that? These are good questions that we should kind of be processing. We kind of naturally do it without realizing we're doing it sometimes, but we also are really good at just kind of skipping over things and skimming over them and being like, well, I kind of believe this. Okay, next, right? And we don't actually know how to articulate it. I would encourage you over the next 7 weeks, begin working on figuring out how you would answer each of these questions in your own words. Don't just go back and read the chapter on Christian theism. Actually, get a pen and paper or a Word document or something, and go, okay, question 1, what is prime reality? How do you explain that? How do you uniquely explain that? You're going to use different words than I am and vice versa, and that's okay. But how do you as a Christian person answer that question, right? That's just good practice. So what is the meaning of human history? What do you think about that as a Christian? How do we process that? And then number 8, he's added this in this edition, and I like that he's added it. What personal, life-orienting core commitments are consistent with this worldview? This is where the rubber meets the road. This is where we start actually processing, okay, am I living in a way that's consistent with what I say on paper is my worldview? Is my actual worldview, the way I'm actually interacting with the world, the way I'm actually engaging my neighbor, the way I'm actually conducting myself, the way I'm actually talking about God, consistent with what I've written down as my answer to these questions? And again, we can get real deep with that and real kind of philosophical with that, right? But these are good questions to ask ourselves. This is a good setup as we get ready to encounter belief systems that are not our own, belief systems that some of us kind of want to just write off and be like, well, that's silly. Belief systems that actually we encounter every day and brush up against without even realizing sometimes, and belief systems that actually, spoiler alert, have maybe different tiny aspects that we've kind of bought into without realizing it. And so this is good practice to, again, I would encourage you, write out all these 8 questions and then begin answering them in your own voice. And that may actually be our last week's worth of homework, so you might want to start now. Just heads up, will this be on the test? Yes, it will be on the test. Okay, let's stop right there and talk a little bit together, because I do have it's a little bit of a lengthy video to show you that goes into a little bit more of an introduction to apologetics. It gives us some terms and some words we need to use, and it gives us some concepts that are good to know, and it's just, it's a video that I was like, I'll just show the video rather than me trying to rehash what's already created in the video. But let's pause there for a second and process together questions, comments. Did anything come up in the reading for you that you're like, I never thought about this before, or this I was shook? What are we thinking? Where are we at? Yes, there are microphones hither and yon. I think on this table and on that table. I don't know if the switches are up or not. So just knock that up, and there you go.
Okay, this is complete honesty. I think to me, the idea of going through all those other worldviews and really considering them like you're asking us to is scary, because what if there are things that I'm like, well, that sounds better.
Yeah.
That sounds right.
Right.
I mean, it makes me very fearful.
Yeah.
I kind of like where I am.
Right. Yeah. Great question. I appreciate.
That's not really a question.
No,
sorry.
but
That's
that's
more
great.
of my
Let's talk about that
emotion.
for a second. Let's talk about that for a second, because the chances are, odds are, you're not the only one who feels that way. Great point. So yeah, I think that you hit the nail on the head. Most of us have not given this a whole lot of consideration. Most of us don't really pause and stop and think, every 6 months, every 3 months, every year, what's my worldview and how has it changed recently? Has anything kind of brushed up against me that's kind of made me change? Or what do I actually believe about this, or something like that? So first of all, let me say that you don't need to be afraid. I'm not invalidating your fear. It's real. But what I'm saying is, we're told that we're loved perfectly by God, and if we're in Christ, there's no fear in love, so we don't need to be afraid. We can be cautious. We can be aware. We can be kind of prayerful readers, but we don't need to be afraid, right? Because here's what will happen is you'll probably read something and be like, I feel like I kind of maybe believe a tiny aspect of that, and I didn't realize it, and I wasn't even completely sure that wasn't consistent with the Christian worldview. What do I do? That's a good thing to realize, right? Like that's fruitful learning. That's good practice for us to be like, oh, I didn't realize that. Now I do. That's good. That's a good thing to be honest about. That's intellectual honesty, right? Here's what I think is going to happen. My bet would be there's going to be a few things you read and you're going to go, I never thought about that in my life. I never considered pantheism as a thing. That just isn't me. Some of us will be like, yeah, I kind of had a little bit of a wild child period of time when I was in college, and I was all for pantheism. It was great, right? Or whatever. And so I think that we're all going to find aspects of things that we're like, yeah, that makes sense to me. And you might try to figure out if there's an aspect or a piece of goodness there. And you might even see aspects of the Christian worldview reflected in certain things. But I think here's our way forward. We're gonna pray for wisdom. We're gonna trust that there's no fear in love. There's no fear in being in right relationship with Jesus. We're gonna trust that the Holy Spirit is inside of us. And we're gonna do this together. Right, you're not going to be alone. You're not going to be no one's going to ask you to be okay, come up here and give a complete defense of everything right now. We're learning together, right? So that's kind of the approach we're going to take. We're going to take it slow as we possibly can. But at the same time, we can trust that we have the Holy Spirit inside of us to guide us, right?
It's like we're the Goonies going in.
Right. Yes. Great comment, though. Thank you for that. What else? Thoughts, questions, concerns? Chris will take it. You might have, I think you have to just flip it up. You can leave it on once it's on. Yeah, there you go.
So this is a little personal in a sense that I'm about to go to a wedding this weekend where I know parts of the part of our family that I know are not believers. And this worldview is so interesting, right? Because they're universalists, all right? And so for them, there's lots of ways, right? Who are you to say? And it seems like the conversation always comes, and they always come to me. And it seems like I'm the person who I'm supposed to answer on behalf of the rest of the family somehow. And I'm dreading it. But one of the things that I was thinking about as you were just speaking and kind of processing what we've read is I know that it's not my job to do anything other than let God do the work, right? And that's freeing. But I also know that I recognize as a statement, I have taken the easy road intellectually because I feel like I'm there. Like, I know where I am. That's your problem, right? And as I'm reading this, I'm starting to recognize that's a little dishonest,
Yeah.
right? And so now as I'm trying to process all this and get prepared for where I know I'm going this weekend and what's going to come, my question is, is it still not my job, right, to answer the questions for others, or is it?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I think, going back to that verse we talked about at the beginning, that you should be ready to give a defense, to give an apologetic for the hope that you have, for the position you have about how the world is and how you fit into that world. That's my kind of exposition of what that text means. So I think that we're called to be able to articulate and give that answer, give that defense, give that apologetic. But what other people do with that apologetic is not on us, right? Now, here's the thing. You talked about intellectual dishonesty and intellectual honesty. Remember how I said you need to be able to understand the other person's position, right? That's intellectual honesty, because it's not intellectually honest for me to just go, well, here's what I believe, and I believe it really strongly, and I think you're silly if you don't believe it, and I think I've actually made a valid argument to present it, but I'm not going to try to understand where you're coming from. That's not good conversational practice. It's good to ask that person questions. It's good to kind of try to get into their argument or their understanding as best as we can, because here's a trick of apologetics. Here's an aspect of apologetics. If you can grasp the other person's position better than they can, you have a much stronger chance of making a good defense. So if you are talking to an atheist, just an atheist, and you can grasp atheism better and explain it better than they can, which takes work, takes intellectual work, you will be a better conversationalist, you will be a better defender of the faith, of the Christian faith, and you'll be able to engage in conversation better than if you simply go like what you're saying, or like, well, I believe that what I have is right, and atheist, I'll listen to you, but at the end of the day, I really think you're just missing out on like so much, and you've made a really poor life choice, but go ahead and tell me what you think. That's not a good place to be, right? So I think that we are called to be able to articulate, to have conversation, to give that explanation. But what other people do with that explanation, ultimately I think is the work of the Spirit, is the work of God in their lives. But we need to be sure that we're not being lazy. And I think that's where a lot of Christians are landing right now, is we're just lazy. We don't know really what we believe, really. And so we definitely don't know what you believe, or we think we know what you believe. And so that's where we start our conversation from. It takes incredible commitment and mental work to do this well. And it's a sacrifice. Like it takes time to be able to engage thoughtfully with the world. But I do think that the pressure is off of us in the sense of like, again, it's not your job to make people Christians. That's the work of the Holy Spirit kind of, but you being a good representative and a good mouthpiece and a good witness is absolutely key. So I walk a fine line between like not wanting to like pressure people and be like, it's all up to you, but also being like, but you got to do the work. Like you got to do the intellectual heavy lifting. And here's the other thing that I talk about with a lot of people. I'm going to say this, and it's going to sound, I'm being hyperbolic, so let me like preface what I'm about to say with that. You have too many Christian friends. You don't have enough non-Christian friends. Most of us hang out with predominantly only Christian people. We might have a token atheist friend or like a friend group that doesn't quite agree with us or a part of the family like Chris, but we're not regularly like rubbing up against, intentionally having deep relationships with people who disagree with us. We might be friends with Christians who have some doctrinal differences than us, right? That feels kind of safer. But most of us are not in close friendship relationships with people who are not Christians. And that's not a good thing. It's not a good thing. So yeah, I think that, again, it's a fine line between you're not responsible for people's salvation. Thank God. We're not responsible. But you definitely can play a role and be a tool in how God reveals salvation to that person. And so we need to accurately represent God. We need to accurately represent the Christian worldview and so on and so forth. But thankfully, it's not my job ultimately to move that person along. I need to be a good guide. I can be a bad guide, and that can actually do damage, right? But yeah, trying to be the best guides we possibly can be. Yeah. David, can we get, you got a mic there. You're good to go.
I'm good.
He's good.
Is there an aspect of apologetics that has to do with training within the church?
What do you mean?
Well, if it seems to me like if you want to bring up your children in the ways they should go, or if you want to train new Christians to what Christianity really means, that you have to be able to explain it to your children and to new Christians.
Yeah.
And so that's what I mean by an aspect of apologetics that is necessary within the church in order to build up the church, even within itself.
Yes. Hopefully that's what some of what we're doing through Institute is doing. That's one of the goals of Institute, is to give you some intellectual stimulation and some intellectual work, and also heart work as well, to then explain your position better, to explain the Christian story better, right? As far as like purposeful training, thinking about kids, thinking about this, I have a lot of opinions about this. So that parents, it's your job. It's not the church's job. It's not the kids' youth leader's job. It's not Sunday school teacher's job. It's your job in the home as parents to do this. Now, that doesn't mean that you have to have a PhD in apologetics, right? Because you're not doing it alone. You're doing it with the church community. You're doing it with leaders. You're doing it in conversation with other Christians. But ultimately, it boils down to you and how you're doing stuff in the home, right? Now, of course, the church comes alongside you. Your family comes alongside you. Organizations come alongside you. But I would just venture to guess that most of us, I have to kind of remind myself, I just had a really weird upbringing when I compared to a lot of other people. It was good and bad, and as most of us are. But I was put in positions to have worldview conversations at a very young age. And so part of that is how we parent. Part of that is how we set up children's ministry, youth group. Part of that is actually having adults who are thinking about this, having parents and having other adults who are thinking about this. Because most of us, like I said at the beginning, probably have gone through portions of our life, good bits of our life, without ever really having to articulate our worldview thoughtfully. It comes out in little ways, right? So hopefully, to your point of like, what is the church doing about this? How are we doing this? Hopefully things like Institute are helping with that. Hopefully things by like bringing in speakers to kind of talk to us about this is helpful. But ultimately at the end of the day, each of us has to do the work. It's kind of like in therapy, like at some point you just have to do the work, right? You got to get down in there and do the work. So again, you got to read the books. You got to ask the hard questions. You got to be willing to be confused for a while. You got to be willing to do things that are uncomfortable. And there's, again, going back to the idea of when we talked about explaining the whole story of the Bible, like, are we helping people understand the overarching narrative of the scriptures? Are we helping people, again, to one of the questions, one of those 8 questions, are we helping people see how humans fit into that story? Things like that. That will feed into your ability to do apologetics. If you understand yourself as a human, if you understand the role of humans, if you understand the story of the world, if you understand what is ultimate, right? All those questions that we just talked about that Sire, the author, is going to kind of address as we move forward. But ultimately, yes, the church should do work to equip people, but we can't expect to be spoon-fed all of it, right? Paul tells us, hey, at some point, you got to get off the milk. You got to sink your teeth into some actual like fried chicken, right? You can't just be eating and like through a sippy cup. You can't just be spoon-fed. You can't always have Institute with someone up here telling you, hey, new thing, here's this, read this book, do this, here's this. At some point, we all have to kind of own it and say, I'm going to do the work. Now, again, we do this in community. It's not an individual enterprise, but at some point it is to a certain extent. And sometimes the church writ large, doesn't help equip people super well when it comes to this. Because we don't talk about it a lot. We kind of talk about it in vague terms. But hopefully you've realized through Institute and through just conversation and reading and learning that you can do it. You can read the books. You can ask the questions. You can join with other people and process and learn to work on our worldview, to work on why we believe what we believe, things of that nature. But it's work. And so trying to figure out how to, in the church, talk about that and how to figure out in the church, how do we kind of orient everything we do around promoting this worldview? Those are ongoing conversations that we have here and that I know friends of mine that are on staff at other churches are having, because it feels like a really big, impossible task sometimes. But at the end of the day, we all have to kind of own it ourselves. Because the church, we want to help hand you information. We want to help kind of spoon feed you to get you started. But then at some point, you got to start walking on your own. Can't always have that little thing that we put the kids in with the wheels, and they kind of like at some point, we got to like take you out of that and say, okay, go for it. And you're going to fall down. I'm going to fall down. I'm going to kind of land on my butt sometimes, right? I'm going to cry a little bit about it. And then I'm going to try to get up and walk. And then eventually you start walking. And then eventually you start running. And then eventually you start running marathons. And eventually you start doing hurdles, right? Most of us in our Christian faith and in our Christian intellectualism are still toddlers. And what we're seeing as we're realizing, I think, not just we in this room, but I think a lot of people are realizing, oh, dang it. We're still toddlers. Like we still have the training wheels on. And we are in a culture and we're in a day and age where everyone else around us, it seems like they're running hurdles with their beliefs and we can't even like get the training wheels off, right? Again, I told you I had a lot of thoughts about this. I'm going to stop there. We could go for a while on that. But yeah, just to your point, just the realization that we need to be having these conversations is hopefully helpful. Yeah.
Yeah, one quick question. I noticed he covers pretty much every religion of the major world religions and the world views associated with them kind of in the subject matter, but I noticed Judaism was not in there. Is that because it's more like deism, or is it going to be more closer to a different subset?
At some point, you just got to end the book,
Okay.
right? He's not covering He's not covering a lot, actually. I mean, he's not covering Mormonism. He's not covering Jehovah's Witnesses. He's not covering Judaism. He's not covering a lot of things, actually. And again, he's not doing apologetics from more of an argument, kind of proofs of God's existence standpoint. So that's just, I think, I chop it up to just editorial decisions. Yeah. Okay. Question back there, and then we will move on to our video.
Just a thought I had, which is, I guess I feel like typically when I encounter Christians, so much of what they have is up here.
In their heads, yeah.
And so rarely does anyone explain to me that they're a Christian because they fell in love with Jesus or they've had some encounter with Jesus. And we hear these stories, but I'm not saying that's conflicting with apologetics, but sometimes now it makes me sad that the conversation has so little heart and so much head. Not that they're not both required, but it's just like, hopefully I didn't fall in love with my husband because I read his bio.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And
I mean, that's online dating for you, so pray for your single friends. Pray for your single friends.
Yes, but then you meet them and you find their quirks and their,
right.
like, that's what I'm saying.
Sure.
And
I think different people need different, I'm going to say this, and hopefully you guys understand what I'm saying. I think different people need different paths to the Christian God. And what I mean by that is some people need it to be an intellectual thing. People who are more science-minded, people who are more left brain, right brain, depending on where you are there. Some people need the ontological, teleological, and cosmological arguments. They need to have it linearly broken down, and they need to be convinced intellectually of the merits of Christianity. Some people, that's how they're wired. I have friends that have come to faith that way. Some people are more experiential. Some people are more, again, left brain, right brain. Some people need to have more of a feeling. I'm not saying it's like, ooh, but like something, beauty needs to move them. The beautiful story of the scriptures needs to move them, and that's what brings them to Christ, right? So I think that we all have different paths to how God has revealed himself to us. Ultimately, always through the person of Jesus, right? But some of that's more of an intellectual thing where we come to actually believe that the Bible is true. Some of us need to experience beauty, and that's what initially grabbed us, right? But here's what I always try to put forward is we can't just stay there, right? We can't just stay with the bio. We can't just stay with a feeling we had, because we all know the people who become Christians, people become a Christian, and they're just really excited, and the first 6 months to a year is like, go, 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 and they're learning, and they're on fire, and they're passionate, and then it kind of fizzles, right? And that's just the nature of humans. That's just kind of our plight in some ways. But that's also just a reality. Like at some point, this isn't as exciting as it was when everything was new. At some point, we have to, again, put away the sippy cup and actually start digging in and doing the work. And that is both invigorating and fun, but there's seasons where it feels really dry. And there's seasons where you just got to keep going and kind of trudging through. There's seasons that are dark where you're not feeling like you're hearing God. But if we just stay with, I believe God exists because X, Y, Z, but that never moves us into loving Jesus or loving others more deeply. Or we just started with wow, the story is really beautiful and it's just so great and I love it. But we never start talking about intellectually approaching it. We need both. We need them to converse with each other. We need the left brain and the right brain. We need all of the corpus of what God has created us to be as human beings. But I do think you're exactly right. We need a conversation between the head and the heart. Some people are more head people. Some people are more heart people, which is why we have the church. One of the reasons we have the church. But we can't just stay where we're more comfortable. And that's a challenge for all of us. We can't just stay. Some of us want to stay up here because it feels safer. Some of us want to stay down here because we don't think we can do the up here part, right? We're more feelers, and we're like, I don't really like reading books, and it's just chat. Some of us need to kind of break out of that and be like, okay, I'm going to challenge myself to move in the opposite direction of what I normally want to do. And that's growth. That's where growth happens. That's a great place to kind of challenge ourselves and learn and experience things. I know doing Institute for some of you was a huge leap, right? Some of you are like more intellectually kind of, and you're already reading the books and you're like, this kind of felt natural to me. Some of you are, this felt completely foreign. And some of us are kind of moving between those things, and I hope that there's been growth there, right? I hope that there's been kind of brain stimulation, but also heart conviction and vice versa. But yeah, we need both of those things in conversation to have a more coherent worldview. Otherwise, we seem really sterile, and we seem really kind of like, this is what the worldview that I have is. And we sound very like Christian and scientific, and we sound very like pious, right? Or we just come across as being like emotionally blabbering all over the place and be like, I just love Jesus. Why? Explain it to me, right? So we need both. We need both. One is not better than the other. We need both. We need a marriage of those things to happen.